Thank you very much, Philippe, again for the excellent sharing of the previous roundtable. It is my pleasure now to open the floor to our second keynote speaker, Professor Susan Athey, who is the Economics of Technology professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Professor Athey is an elected member of the National Academy of Science and is a recipient of numerous awards, including the John Bates Clark Medal for her contributions to the field. She's one of the first tech economists, and in that capacity, role, or expertise, she served as consulting chief economist for Microsoft for approximately 6 years. Professor Athey has seated on the boards of several private and public technology firms. She was also a founder as associate director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. In 2022, and that will probably speak to the expertise on the previous panel, she took leave from Stanford to serve as chief economist at the US Department of Justice Antitrust Division. In 2023, she became president of the American Economics Association. Professor Athey's research focuses on topics very dear to the fields of interest represented in this conference. She has been focusing in her work on the economics of digitalization, marketplace design, and the intersection of econometrics and machine learning. She has worked on many applications areas, including auction research, internet search, and online advertising. Some two facts that are not really known to the antitrust community, I would assume, include running something called the Golub Capital Social Impact Lab at Stanford, where Professor Athey has used a tech toolkit for social impact in collaboration with social sector organizations. The second unknown fact, most likely, is that she is the co-author of a very popular software package called Generalized Random Forests that has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times and used in tech firms as well as by academics. So Professor Athey embodies the ideal of research, policy, practice, and actual technology expertise into one person, and we are very delighted and honored to have her with us today. So Susan, we have approximately 45 minutes. Can you hear us well?
Perfectly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, the floor is yours now. Thank you very much again.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks to everyone for listening. I know how hard it can be to watch someone speak for a long time on Zoom, so I'll try to be provocative and keep a few zingers coming to keep you all awake. So let me now share my slides. So today what I want to do is talk a little bit about theoretical issues that run through the economics literature on innovation and dynamics, and then talk about how we worked to embed those in the drafting of the 2023 merger guidelines. Of course, I'm not in government now, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any government agency, so my comments are, of course, my own. So just, this whole conference is full of experts, and so I know all of you have thought about all of these things before. So to try to say something that's new or beyond what's already being discussed can be a little bit challenging, but nonetheless, let me try to sort of organize some of the debates the way that I see them. So when I think about, first of all, the big picture questions in terms of dynamic competition and innovation, a first question I think about is whose innovation? Whose innovation matters? And so there can be a very loose idea that, any kind of antitrust enforcement will naturally be bad for innovation, which is not at all aligned with what I've seen as a advisor for startups, as worked in venture capital investing, in sitting on boards of startups. It's absolutely not the case that enforcement is always bad for innovation. In fact, enforcement can be critical for enabling innovation, and it can open up whole new areas of innovation that are clamped down. And that's not a new discussion. We talked about it since the Microsoft case, and the disincentives for innovation that can occur when you have a dominant firm, Microsoft in the 90s, that was potentially squashing adjacent firms. In the modern world where we have these so many platforms, a startup probably has to interact with multiple platforms in order to get going. And in general, many thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of firms are platforms participants, and their innovation matters. And they may be the ones who are more directly creating value for end consumers, depending on the context. A second really big question is, what type of innovation do we have in mind? Do we have in mind incremental innovation, or what I put in big air quotes, disruptive innovation? And in general, the simplest economic models have a very, very narrow set of choices. And that doesn't at all resemble what a firm is thinking about. If you were in a corporate strategy group, thinking about what should a firm do, or what mergers and acquisitions are going to happen, they're definitely not just thinking about price and quality. And quality is hard to get and requires a lot of risky innovation, and that may or may not pay off. While there's other types of innovation that might be easier and more likely to improve profits, but that doesn't benefit consumers. And so that richer set of firm choices is critical to have in mind when we're thinking about innovation. And more broadly, all the people in a firm have expertise. The status quo, it may be working for them. If they're a dominant firm, the status quo is working for them very well. So anything that risks changing the status quo could open the pathway to the status quo changing. And the status quo could have something to do with business models, or the way that consumers engage with their products, in what technology setting consumers engage with their products. There's many different versions of this, but ultimately, there's some types of innovation that are that established firms have a very hard time doing, and are highly disincentivized to do, when they think about the asymmetries in the payoffs of those innovation of changing the status quo. And generally, why do firms innovate? Beyond Schumpeter, we know that if you won't get any returns on your innovation, you won't innovate. But what does it mean to have monopoly? Or an entrenched monopolist that thinks that is not really worried about future entry. Then they don't have to make these tough choices and take these hard risks, to innovate in ways that could open the door for other entrants to come in various ways. And so being entrenched will affect your incentives in the future. So really thinking about the consumer of the future, and thinking hard about why will a firm need to try as hard as they can to understand their customer needs, and to create the products and features that those customers want. Why will they be doing that? What exactly is the competitive pressure that leads them to do that? And if they're entrenched, that competitive pressure may be lower. So I think really a lot of the theories about mergers that have come back and been revisited as maybe having been mistakes had dynamic theories of harm, and some of these questions are very relevant for thinking about them. So, embedded in all this are some implicit assumptions in, the 1960s economics that still that plays a big role in antitrust thinking. First of all, when a firm faces a threat to its market position, its only options are to take actions that are aligned with consumer welfare, like decrease price or increase quality. So that assumption is very divorced from reality, and especially in modern markets where there are so many ways in which a firm, especially a firm with market power, can affect the functioning of the market through the structure. What information is provided? What are the frictions? How are things packaged? How firms can affect distribution of competing products. So there's so many elements of the choice set that are beyond decreasing price and increasing quality, and many of them are not aligned with consumer welfare. They create externalities, and they're more aligned with increasing the profits of the firm at the expense of the consumers. A second point is the long-run effect of a merger can be well understood by considering the static, non-forward-looking incentives of firms in the market. And that's an assumption that's embedded in the 2010 merger guidelines. It's, of course, the 2010 merger guidelines were a large advance, and they brought in a lot of economics. And it makes sense to bring in first the simplest and kind of easiest to analyze economics, which are the economics of short-run competition, the simple textbook models where firms are maximizing profits today. And that framework works, especially in an environment where we've kind of considered the main dimensions of competition, and those are things that line up or are similar to price and quality. But in cases where a firm might make a sacrifice today in order to entrench itself and maintain very large monopoly profits into the future, that framework will just miss those effects and might focus you on the wrong forces, and really not capture what's actually going on. And I want to say, from the perspective of litigation, there can be a challenge if an economist stands up and talks about a very simple textbook theory and a set of textbook forces, and that's not at all what's in the firm's documents or is the actual motivation of the merger. So sometimes people ask, well, isn't it complicated? Isn't it too complicated to move away from a textbook model? And I would say, in response to that, that if the textbook model is completely divorced from reality, probably that economic argument isn't going to be very effective, because it just doesn't engage with the rest of what's happening in the case, and it loses credibility, because it's imagining firms are thinking about things in a different way than they are. So the extent to which there's a broader dynamic motivation at play in the industry, and both market participants are perceiving and responding to that, the theory needs to be at least complicated enough to engage in the forces that are driving behavior. A next kind of assumption that's implicit is, that fixed costs and entry barriers are exogenous, and growing markets or profits lead to entry. And of course, that assumption then in turn drives the follow-on that errors in enforcement are self-correcting, because if you make a mistake and some market power is created, it'll be eroded. But in an environment where there are barriers to entry, and in fact where gaining market power gives you the ability and the tools to structure the market, change the structure of the market, and change the functioning of the market, change the primitives of the market, then you will not get that future self-correction. And in fact, you are maybe especially unlikely to get that self-correction. And in fact, the motivation for the merger may be to create long-run entry barriers, in which case you're not expecting it to be self-correcting. A few other more sort of detailed implicit assumptions, and I think some of those were also raised, at least one of them on the previous panel. But one implicit assumption is that mergers are the only solution for producers of complementary products to internalize externalities. So and vertical integration is an example of this, but in the modern digital world, there are lots of different examples of products potentially being complementary, not being in the same product market, not being direct substitutes. And of course, in the modern world, there are so many of those interactions among firms that we see a whole wide range of contractual arrangements and business deals that help internalize externalities. On the opposite side of that, we often see when firms merge that they don't change their internal structure in a way that would fully internalize these externalities either. So the delta between, without the merger and with the merger in reality is often much, much smaller than the textbook would suggest. And so being able to embrace more broadly what firms do to solve these problems and understand what's actually merger specific is an important area of inquiry. And finally, this is broadly discussed in the last few years, especially, is that consumer decisions are primarily driven by price or quality, and they're endowed with an understanding of their choice set. And I vividly remember when I first went to work on a search engine and saw like all the R&D was about figuring out which order things go in, and that had a huge effect. And it was eye-opening for me in the late 2000s to think, oh my goodness, like a large firm controls people's news and their information or their misinformation, as we later saw. It can pick winners and losers. That's an awful lot of power, and you saw it clearly with randomized controlled trials. I do remember talking to economists at that time, and they thought, well, you're just talking about rolling your eyeballs. How hard can it be? And I'm like, okay, but I'm looking at empirical evidence here, and I see what it is. I see that impact, and so getting things to be more realistic. And but again, when we think from the perspective of firms and on the firms that I've worked with, the idea of customer distribution being a big deal, and that there is power from the people that get between you and your customer. That is a core fundamental concept that that the business community recognizes, and we were a little bit slow to incorporate. But that it was basically on these unstated and untrue core assumptions. And of course, once these things can be endogenously chosen, once a firm can choose the nature of competition, the nature of information provision, they can affect the way that consumers make decisions or make them for consumers. That can move the choices away from choices that put pressure on price and quality, and that reduces the incentives for innovation, because if your consumers are choosing for reasons other than the quality of the product, that's going to diminish the incentive to make the product good. So when I think about how this fits in with the economics literature, I still get surprised when either lawyers or maybe macroeconomists or others who are outside of IO say, oh, well, we just, economists think that, the world is perfectly competitive. And I'm like, no, that was like the whole point of most of the IO literature and a lot of the microeconomic theory literature since the 60s, 70s. This has been the main focus is imperfect competition, and a lot of that has been dynamic. Certainly, those were some things I worked on in the 1990s when I was primarily an economic theorist. So, this is of course, this has been a key focus. IO economics has brought in ideas and in interaction with antitrust, things like raising rivals' costs, predation, creating barriers to entry, network effects, interoperability. These have been themes that have been coming up and been part of the literature. Now, one of the interesting things, though, is the world is complex. So theorists try to write simple models so that they provide insight. When the world has multiple moving parts, the models get messy. And actually, it can be hard for researchers to publish those papers, because who wants a messy model that has multiple forces going on, and it may not be as insightful. So one thing that's super important for the antitrust community to do is to state very clearly how important the problems are we're solving, and state clearly what the dimensions of complexity are, so that researchers can say, hey guys, this model may be a little complicated, but I really need all these forces to even start to capture what's going on in the world. So that one of the challenges of trying to read and apply this literature, even if you're an expert in the literature, is that the models, each paper focuses on one thing at the time. They often don't endogenize some important relevant factors. Maybe the firms get to choose one or two things, but not the full suite of choices that firms have in reality. So there still can be a challenge about this. And so what researchers often do is they say, okay, here's a market, and I'm going to study what happens if certain factor changes exogenously. When in practice, the firms are actually choosing that variable or affecting it, and that can really make a big difference. So you might have a paper that says, well, when this variable changes, anything can happen, but it's often bad when the firm chooses it, because the firm is actually only making the choice when it's profitable for the firm. And so it's a much smaller set of choices that are good for both firms and all of their customers, and competition. But in general, despite those limitations of the literature, so not saying the literature is perfect, that certainly the literature has raised common themes. Themes like, when scale economies are present, short-run actions can lead to long-run impacts. So that makes it possible for a firm to shape the structure of the market. And if a firm can make an investment to change future market power, then the incentives of the firm are misaligned with welfare. And so one way to categorize all this is that there's sort of externalities everywhere. There's a paper by Farrell and Weiser that talks about, incomplete complementarity versus a single monopoly profit theory. Basically, the idea that, a firm may not internalize all of the benefits of its output on its customers if some customers are also consuming other products, and there's some complementarity between products where the firm of interest is not serving them. And in general, as I've alluded to multiple times already, some products or product choices affect the nature of competition in adjacent markets. For example, there can be products like price comparison tools that might lower switching costs or make an entire market more competitive. And that can be very threatening for the firms in the market. But this tool is actually, it's sort of making it's improving market structure, and thus having externalities on all consumers, not just consumers of the tool. So this slide is like really basic economics, but I just want to remind everyone about the basic economics of a startup firm to remind people why we should care about market power if we care about innovation. So if you're a startup firm, that's trying to grow, one of the ways that the startup firms will frame things, and the way the venture capitalists will analyze the prospects of a startup firm, is they'll essentially look at the long-term value of a customer minus the customer acquisition cost minus the marginal cost. This is for like a B2C type of business. And so you can think of what the firm is doing is it's trying to grow as fast as possible, so that it can cover its R&D costs and not run out of money. And it needs to convince the venture capitalist that it's long-term sustainable. That is, in the long-term, the long-term value of a customer will be greater than the customer acquisition cost and the marginal cost. And if I think about, dominant firms and platforms and what role they can play in affecting this equation, the customer acquisition cost, of course, any firm that controls advertising markets or controls access to consumers through their platforms, they can have a big impact on the customer acquisition cost. Also, venture capitalists will be worried if there is some possibility that customer acquisition cost could go up in the future if an intermediary picks a different winner. So they care not just about today's customer acquisition cost, but also tomorrow's. A payment platform can have a big impact on marginal cost. And so these firms are working really hard to do everything they can to eke out a profit and to not be bleeding money so that they don't, so they can get to the next round of funding. And they're also working really hard to figure out whether they will be able to sustain the business in the long term. And both the predictable taxes placed on them by intermediaries, as well as the threat of large changes in their ability to access customers, have a huge negative impact on entry, innovation, and funding. So while venture capitalists like to publicly complain about their inability to sell a firm to the monopolist that competes with their firm, privately, they all grouse extensively about how the fact that they're raising money from their limited partners and basically writing a check to the intermediaries just to get access to the businesses, to the customers for their on behalf of their businesses. And so they're very well aware that these taxes are in the end a huge portion of the money they raise go to paying intermediaries, and a lot of companies can't cover those costs, and so they don't get invested in at all. So now I want to kind of switch gears a little bit to talk about how the 2023 merger guidelines incorporate a lot of those concepts that I've just outlined and how they connect to economic theory. So just in thinking about the motivation for having some of these more complex theories laid out in guidelines, it is important, I believe, to have the theories that the agencies are considering articulated in merger guidelines. So it's not a good thing if agencies are investigating theories and those theories are emerging from documents and investigations, and there's just no mention of those theories in any of the guidelines. So it's just as an example, the Visa Plaid merger, the DOJ alleged that the merger between Visa and Plaid, a fintech provider, would entrench monopoly power by increasing the barriers to entry. That theory was not stated in either the horizontal or vertical merger guidelines at the time. Now, they still brought the theory, but then from the perspective of emerging parties, they have very little written guidance about how, even what the theories would be and how the agencies would evaluate such theories. And then from the perspective of the agencies, the staff also are kind of starting with a somewhat of a blank piece of paper, or having to go back to the economics literature, research literature. And that can really slow down an investigation. You don't have a common language to talk about. And another example was the Adobe Figma merger, which was abandoned in 2023. And one of the theories that would not have been covered by the previous guidelines would be the theory that of the impact that Adobe acquiring Figma would have on Adobe's core markets. And of course, if you ask most people on the street why they wouldn't want a merger like that to happen, if they're customers, they could tell you about the things they would worry about in terms of what happens to the products and what happens to competition for these products. And a lot of people may feel like they don't have meaningful choice, and they may not like the innovation or lack thereof that's occurred in some of those core products. Or feel like the innovation, the product hasn't really fully incorporated consumer preferences. So they would worry about those types of considerations. I also like to think about other types of hypotheticals or scenarios. What if in the 1990s, Microsoft had tried to build a browser and their browser wasn't very good, and instead of trying to, shove it down people's throats, instead they bought Netscape? How would we evaluate that merger? What would be the theory under which that merger is considered? And so we would want to have that kind of a theory in the guidelines. And of course, that becomes, again, these things are complicated. You say, well, gosh, like, how can you actually write these things down? And doesn't that create a lot of complexity for guidelines? But on the other hand, there's been a lot of pressure that the deficiencies of under-enforcement have also become apparent from modern business customers and end consumers who feel like they lack meaningful choice. And they also see the disconnect between kind of the very stylized theory and their their own experience reality. In terms of not having choices, not having being, if you're an advertiser or you're a small business and you want to call customer service and you find out it doesn't really exist, even though your business is at stake. That tends to make people mad, and it also tends to make them question whether the theoretical framework that allowed all of these mergers really captured their reality. So how does the merger guidelines try to address these things? The 2023 merger guidelines. So there's a set of tools that in my view were reinforcing. So tools that were complementary to one another in the production of useful guidelines. If you think of each of these as inputs to a product, the product being the guidelines. So a couple of tools, I won't have time to talk today about the framing of competition. That was something that got a lot of input, and the antitrust community contributed a huge amount to getting that framing down in a way that people broadly felt reflected what economists were thinking about when they think about competition and what antitrust scholars are thinking about. So, and that's been starting to get more traction as well. But a second tool, so if you haven't read it, take a look at the second paragraph of the 2023 guidelines and see how that's framed, and realize that there was a lot of opinions about every word in that paragraph, but we were pretty happy with where it landed. Carl Shapiro recently wrote a nice comment about that in a blog post, and how he appreciated that definition. The uncertainty and risk assessment. So that is a pretty crucial tool. And it's one that the 2010 guidelines and all guidelines have in the past have of course discussed the statute in the U.S. that talks about whether the effect of a merger may be a substantial lessening of competition. But that becomes crucial when trying to deal with dynamics. And so we carried that concept more deeply, and we elevated it and fleshed out what it meant a lot more detail than previous guidelines had. Another key point was supporting theories of harm grounded in economic theory with a flexible approach to evidence. So one way I look at the way the guidelines came out is that they were very crisp about economic theories of harm, all of which are very grounded in economic theory. But they are realistic about quantification and the completeness of models. So understanding that we may have a variety of different pieces of evidence that all fit into a clear economic framework, but may not have a fully complete theoretical or empirical model that captures everything. And that brings us back in line with the way that economics research is done. We look at one thing at a time. Often in our research, we know that we're looking at one thing at a time, but then we reason about how it all fits together, guided by theory. We recognize modern realities, things like non-price competition and multi-product firms, and then the rebuttals are also very important, and I'll come to that shortly. In terms of dynamics, here are some key examples, and I'll get partway through this list today. Frameworks for non-horizontal mergers, entrenchment, ecosystems, platforms, niche and nascent competitors, potential competition, serial acquisitions. All of these are things that are much more fleshed out here than in previous guidelines. I sat on many panels discussing these guidelines, and one scholar put it in a way that I liked. She said, these guidelines have not forgotten about the consumer. They're just more focused on the consumer of tomorrow rather than only the consumer of today. And I think that's what a lot of these frameworks and theories of harm are about, exactly about the impact of mergers on tomorrow's consumers. And a lot of the theories of harm are about how mergers might change the structure of future markets in a way that is not aligned with welfare. So let me start with the rebuttals. This was something that a lot of people missed in the draft version we released, and it is something that still it's important to re-elevate if you're reading quickly. The rebuttals are phrased very broadly, and they connect directly to the competition idea. So basically, they say a rebuttal evidence showing that no substantial lessening of competition is threatened by a merger is a valid rebuttal. That's kind of a catch-all. Of course, you need a clear statement of competition in order for that to have meaning, and there is a statement of competition, and there are tools to analyze and measure competition. So that all together, the tools, the competition definition, and this catch-all rebuttal idea allows you to bring forward ideas that have been discussed relating to dynamic competition. So one thing that people have worried about in the dynamic competition framework is, what if there are scale economies? What if you have two weak firms and and they want to merge in order to be a stronger competitor? In principle, that fits very neatly into this setup. There's a flexible approach. Competition is the bottom line. And if you can show the structure of this market is that the strength of the number two firm or the number three firm is essential for the outcomes in the market, then a merger that accomplishes that can increase competition. But the key is that the burden is on the merging parties to show that this will be a more competitive market afterwards, and that those benefits pass through to the customers in the market who are the beneficiaries of the competition. So it's not just about my cost will be lower. The point is that this will make me a more effective competitor, which will thereby by definition pass through. And of course, you also have to consider what if that makes it easier to collude, because there's not just static competition in terms of static Nash equilibrium, but also the ability to collude, the ability to for strategic considerations that come into play. And I should say, in practice, a lot of those things are not just pricing and quality. They're like, well, if I go into this market, then they might come into that market. If I start moving in a direction that encroaches on their key customer segments, that'll toughen competition. Maybe I should move in this other direction. Let's think about how the other firm will respond when I do something. All that kind of reasoning goes outside of like the static price quantity Nash equilibrium, and having a small number of firms can make those considerations more concerning. But nonetheless, the scale economies, so you have a hurdle to come over, because you might be making strategic behavior of that sort, dynamic strategic behavior, more problematic. But if there's international competition and you need scale to compete, that's part of the analysis. And if a merger is going to pass through to better competition, better global competition, then that's part of our framework, and that's part of the 2023 merger guidelines framework. I keep saying our. I'm not in government, so apologies for the slips. And so finally, merger specificity, and the burdens on the merging parties to show that mergers of complements will result in merger-specific benefits. And that was a pretty controversial point, I would say, probably the most controversial out of all of this. But it partly comes from the agency's experience seeing that, in fact, before a merger, they find ways to internalize externalities, and merger retrospectives where after mergers, firms still didn't actually fully internalize externalities, and efficiency benefits didn't materialize as promised. So that helps motivate a more putting the burden on the merging parties to show why they're different. The risk assessment framework, again, maybe we elaborate on that in pretty substantial, the merger guidelines elaborate on that. They talk about a reasonable probability of substantially lessening competition. And I've talked about some of these benefits already. It aligns economic evidence and expert testimony more closely with best research practice. You model some things and you don't model other things. But if you see in a simple model a problem, then that problem may generalize to a more complex model. But you have to recognize that your models are often only measuring the shorter term things. And so we have to have it. For dynamics, we may just have an economic framework where we put in a mixture of evidence, some quantitative evidence, some documentary evidence, some qualitative evidence, and sometimes bounds. Just here, the monopoly profits are so large relative to whatever's happening in the short run that it's likely that that will drive incentives, even if you can't quantify it. I'm a little bit short on time, so I think I'm actually going to skip over this and go to entrenchment. So entrenchment, and one of the key challenges in putting theories of entrenchment of dominant firms' market power into the guidelines is that it can be hard to explain the difference between concerns about mergers that entrench market power and competition on the merits. After all, a merger that helps a company make its products better will also make it hard for people to compete with them. So how do you tell the difference? And drafting that was pretty challenging, and we got a lot of feedback on the draft guidelines that were released in 2023. In the final that were released, and they rely on concepts and terminology from the monopolization literature. They talk about distinguishing anti-competitive entrenchment from growth, and they use words like exclusionary conduct. And a lot of the language and terminology in that guideline is drawn from a literature where we have a lot of experience trying to distinguish those concepts. Another really important thing that this does is it says, hey, if you've got a dominant firm, like I'm investigating a merger where this firm is dominant, they've been dominant for a long time, they're earning lots of profits, it's no secret that they're earning lots of profits. The simplest theory says like entry should have already occurred. Somebody should have come and competed away those profits. So why hasn't that happened? And whatever it is, your theory about what's going to happen after the merger or the risk of the merger needs to grapple with the forces that led to the situation we're in today. And in particular, looking at whether a merger relates to, reinforces, or supplements the sources of market power, the barriers to entry. And so the dynamic concepts that are involved here are that creating or preserving dominance can be an important motivation for the merger and also a driver of post-acquisition behavior. They might undertake costly short-term strategies to get long-term benefits of dominance. And so the agencies are thinking about these long-term impact of the merger on market power and industry dynamics. They also, the guidelines have a little bit of a nod to ecosystems, which has come up in European antitrust as well. Everybody defines it a little differently and talks about the concepts differently. One of the things that the 2023 guidelines talk about is how a nascent competitive threat might be a firm that serves a niche and they overcome entry barriers by just being really good at one small thing or one segment, but then they might grow or add to them over time and grow into a constraint. It might be that the combination of a bunch of independent firms together creates a constraint. And in that way, a nascent threat might not just constrain the firm today or constrain the firm in one product category, but they might also be a complement to other entering firms. So if you're another entering firm coming in a different niche, you might say, well, who's going to buy my product? And why would they forego this great established dominant product that everybody's buying? How can I get consumers off of that onto my small niche product that's better at what it does? And one way a consumer could do it is they could piece together offerings from multiple firms. And so you could have an ecosystem of independent firms that are complementary to one another in that way. And even those firms might have some kinds of joint distribution deals, which is very common for startups. So this type of issue comes up a lot, and it's in the entrenchment section of the guidelines, but it's a particular issue in platform markets where firms have to solve the chicken and egg problem. So finally, on platforms, the merger guidelines basically bring in and combine some of the theories like entrenchment and non-horizontal mergers into one place, but they try to flesh out the complexity in one place. They incorporate, I think, motivations, I would say, is like lessons from business school, in that if you were, and I've taught platforms to MBAs for a long time now, if you're teaching MBAs or you're advising businesses, you need to think, first of all, like, what are the threats to a dominant platform? Well, a niche entrant can solve the chicken and egg problem of platforms in a narrow category and grow from there. along the lines I just talked about. But there are other possibilities, like there could be an intermediary that aggregates a large set of customers and can steer them to another platform. Or a particular platform participant might be so important that people go around the platform. Or that platform participant might be so important that if it forms an exclusive with one of the platforms, it could tip the nature of competition and pick winners in the industry. So, one of the things that the merger guidelines do is they lay out a theory of harm, and they specifically, in a pretty succinct paragraph plus footnote, outline the economic theory of self-preferencing and an example of when that can be harmful. And they show that can happen if a platform, or they lay out a theory of harm where that can happen, where a platform with substantial market power buys a platform participant, and there are scale economies or entry barriers for the platform participants' product. And so it talks about how what some benefits from steering can be. Steering to your own product can give you those profits today, but actually there might be longer term effects as well. And so the criticism of self-preferencing theory is, oh, well, if you self-preference, then people will just choose another platform. But what if the platform participant itself has scale economies? Where's the discipline then? If there's a dominant platform and they choose the winner, which is a dominant platform participant, and kill the other competitors to that, which can occur if you have scale economies or learning by doing or other types of things, network effects in the platform participants business, then consumers won't see any benefit from going to another platform to find better search and better options, because those options will be dead. And in fact, if a platform controls a very successful platform participant and there aren't a lot of competitors to that platform participant, then the platform can make that platform participant exclusive to their platform, which harms competition between platforms. So in this particular scenario, the dynamic effects, far from alleviating your concern, the dynamic effects are actually the source of the concern. The concern is that the acquisition hurts long-term competition on the platform, as well as long-term competition between platforms. So this is a dynamic theory, and it's laid out in some detail, although succinctly in the merger guidelines in a way that's very consistent with economic theory. So I'm just about out of time, I think. So I think I will stop there. As I highlighted, there's a long list of ways that the 2023 merger guidelines did in fact try to incorporate dynamics and dynamic theories of harm in a way that's very tightly connected to economic theory, and is feasible because it discusses these theories in the context of a risk assessment framework, and with a flexible approach to evidence. And finally, it enables us to finally start having theories that are both theories of harm that are articulated in the guidelines, that also match up with the way that industry participants are thinking about and their true motivations for the decisions they're making, which in the end, I think, is a simplification rather than a complexification. But of course, all that remains to be seen how they play out in practice. But certainly trying to lead teams doing complex investigations, having some guideposts and having the mathematical economic theory papers sort of translated into the kinds of theories in a form that they're going to be useful for investigations can speed up investigations and make the whole process more predictable. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Okay, so we're going to take 5-10 minutes for questions and answers, and then we'll do the break. Are there any comments or questions? David.
Susan, excellent presentation. Thank you. You mentioned the need to have a coherent theory of the sources of dominance, and I was wondering whether the study of capabilities would flow into that. And I was also wondering about the merger guidelines, where there is a heading, actually, I think, which invites or requires one to look at both incentives and capabilities. But then there's no content in the guidelines whatsoever, at least that I noticed, with respect to what is the nature of capabilities and how does one study capabilities. So it's a two-barreled question that relates to how do organizational capabilities and business level capabilities come into play in the frameworks that you're using?
So great question. So capability and ability are actually, I think they're capability, I think you're part of knowing where you're coming from in the strategy literature. Of course, capability is a defined and studied term there, while ability and incentive and ability is also a defined and studied term. I think in the drafting of the guidelines, in researching, it seemed like the line between ability and incentive was often blurry and was not consistently applied. And so it seemed that trying to draw that line created complication in exposition that wasn't really necessary. So you can see the result of a decision to kind of lump together incentive and ability in the non-horizontal discussions. So that's a choice. It's kind of hard to actually to draw the line. In terms of firm capabilities as being important, that is, of course, a tricky one, because capabilities, there's a lot of literature about how hard it is to change capabilities, but yet, sometimes they do change, and they sometimes change when they need to change. So it's, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So yeah, we did, there's not a lot in the guidelines fleshing that particular element out. It's a bit fact specific. I guess there's capabilities and there's incentives, and when you go beyond just the incentives of the firm and think about the firm as a monolith acting in its economic incentive, start unpeeling that onion. One of the things I think you see in terms of what types of innovations firms do is, yes, part of it is what is capability, and part of it is in fact incentives. So you have middle managers who are very invested in one technology or one way of doing things, and this new thing comes along, and their human capital won't be very relevant for this new thing. So that can pile on to the many other reasons a dominant firm is afraid to do innovation that might go in a different direction than its existing capabilities. And their existing capabilities may also be tied up in a structure of a market where they're dominant. So like if a new technology comes along, whether, I don't know, it's PCs, Windows, or whether it's mobile, or virtual reality, or it's some new thing by AI, digital assistants, like there's some new technology that's coming along. If you feel a lot of competitive pressure, then firms adopt it, even though it might make obsolete all of their engineers' human capital, or many of their engineers' human capital. But they might prefer that they don't go there, because in the current system, they have some tacit knowledge, and they have a lot of people who are very invested in this way of doing things, in addition to the fact that the firm's profits are also very invested in this. And so it's not unrelated that you don't want to switch to something new. It not only isn't aligned with your decision makers, it also opens up a bigger, maybe still small, but a bigger risk that your entire source of profits and competitive advantage and barriers to entry go away. So I don't know, that's maybe not, that's the best I can do to answer your question, but I think it is something that I'd love to see more on, is this the connection between like what is truly exogenous in the capabilities, and how do these capability arguments line up with the firm's incentives for entrenchment versus line up towards what would be good for social welfare.
Thank you, Susan. Is there any other question? Please.
Thank you for your great speech. I would like to ask if you feel that the new guidelines emphasize structural presumptions slightly more than the 2010 guidelines. That's as an opening question, perhaps. And more concretely, I'm thinking of Guideline 8, which says that mergers should not further a trend towards concentration. So I'm trying to understand what that means in practice. Does it imply that any trend towards concentration, regardless of the effect on prices or consumers, and regardless of how that trend came about, should be blocked? Thank you.
The second thing, I don't think that's what the guidelines say, and I think generally the first guidelines are like kind of core frameworks, and then a lot of the later guidelines are either combinations or applications of those frameworks, or kind of elaborations of additional theories. And so one thing that this section talks about is that you're going to look at the whole series, a whole series of acquisitions, and you're going to look at the history, the current and future incentives, and so it seems pretty uncontroversial that you're going to want to understand the merger in the context of what's been happening. And so I guess I definitely, one other kind of a very important answer to the question is that the guidelines have a very robust rebuttal, stronger in some ways, more defendant friendly than rebuttals in the past. And so I think it would be very hard to say that any merger is illegal because of X, Y, and Z, because all of these are rebuttable. These are the guidelines are theories of harm, and there's a rebuttal that says, no, there's not a loss of competition. The guidelines kind of tell you what you need to rebut. So going back to like simple horizontal mergers, if you're going to show that your merger doesn't harm competition despite violating the structural presumption, you need to show why this merger is going to result in more competition. Like, we have scale economies, and let me show you the scale economies, and let me explain why lack of scale has hampered competition in the past and enabled the leading firm in the industry to enjoy huge markups. And hey, if we give our scale economies, we believe that their markups will fall. We'll increase market share, and their markups will fall, and that will be good for consumers. So that's like very vanilla, that's anticipated and accounted for in the guidelines, that type of defense, and it's there. But you would also need, as I mentioned, to explain why, if you're going from 3 to 2, those two firms aren't going to divide up the market or stay out of each other's way or tacitly collude, which becomes a lot easier if you go from 3 to 2. But it can also become easier if you go from 6 to 5 or 5 to 4. You can reason about your rivals. It's easier to kind of differentiate and stay out of each other's way. So so both of those things would need to be rebutted. I think that what's a little different about these guidelines is that they do kind of separate out the theory of harm from the rebuttal. But the rebuttal is very, very flexible, and would account for the most important dynamic innovation stories that people would think about.
Okay, so one last short question from Richard to Susan, and then we close here.
Thank you, Susan. There's a section in the guidelines on innovation competition, and it says something to the effect that the agencies might define markets in different ways to reflect the competitive circumstances. So I would just say hint research and development markets, which are still in the IP guidelines, but haven't made their way into the merger guidelines. So what were you thinking about when in that paragraph about alternative market definition for our research and development and innovation?
Well, so I think it is intended to be flexible and to account for those types of scenarios where you might have, where I guess I I don't know that I have that much to add to what's written. It's intended to be flexible and to account for not just like the standard case where you can kind of, what product you're innovating for. So like these two drug companies are racing for a particular drug. And so I can like very cleanly say, all right, I'm looking for the future market for, certain type of vaccine. And so I can reason about what competition looks like in that market, but also situations where you might be earlier stage. And so there's more of a it's not as clear what that final product market will be.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. So I think it's time to close now. I want to express gratitude for engaging with us online and giving us this deep dive into the merger guidelines and all the hard work that has gone into the text. So thank you very much for explaining all this and setting out the thinking behind. There will be other opportunities maybe for you to join us in Florence in the future. This is a repeated game, as the economists say, and we're in for the long game. David Tiss would certainly confirm this. So thanks again, a round of applause for our keynote speaker, and see you at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, and apologies again to not be there. Florence is a lovely place to be, especially with all those brilliant people, so thank you.
Okay.